Talking today to a very special visiting fellow at the Oxford Martin School here in the University of Oxford, to Karen Florini, who for 2 years was the Deputy Special Envoy for Climate Change at the United States Department of State in the Obama administration. And so, Karen, I can't help turning immediately to that issue, because you were in one of the hot seats on one of the most difficult problems facing humanity. Now, one of the ways in which sometimes we explain to people what the impact of this is to ask the question, if everybody lived like people do in North America, and we had the same population in the world, we might need the area of 4 Earths to support them. Is that really true? And what do you make of that?
I haven't done those calculations myself, but I think it's a very interesting analogy, because what it highlights for us all is the scope of the problem that we need to be addressing, both in terms of climate impacts, but also in terms of environmental matters across the board. We make massive use of materials, we make massive use of substances for energy, we make massive disruptions of ecosystems, and indeed, I don't know whether 4 is exactly the right number, but clearly substantially more than the one Earth that is indeed the one that we've got.
Yes, so that's serious, first point, isn't it? That's not just tinkering with... I mean, we can't get 4 Earths. That's very obvious.
Not anytime soon, at any rate.
So what can we do about this?
Well, the climate issue in particular is one where we know what the causes are, and we thus know what some of the solutions are. We don't have every solution fully developed, but we certainly know enough to start on with. And even though we're not now in a place where we can dictate or specify with particularity exactly what's going to happen, exactly where, and exactly when, we certainly know enough to be started on solving the problem, which is indeed an extremely serious one. Sometimes the climate problem gets rather abstract, but I think what's essential for us all to keep in mind is that we're talking about impacts that have major consequences for individual humans, for human societies, and for our civilization as a whole. More droughts, more deluges, more displacements happening more or less simultaneously, more or less everywhere. So those are very serious consequences to be happening on top of one another in a cascading way that makes them all much more difficult to deal with. And we may actually end up with somewhat fewer hurricanes, but the ones that we do get will be the Category 4 and Category 5, the most destructive at all. Exactly.
Yes. Do you think that people are sufficiently aware? Because in one sense, we've got the evidence before us that it's already happening. This is not just a matter of waiting for our great-grandchildren to experience something. It's happening now. So why isn't there a much greater reaction by people about it?
Well, I think we're still at the beginning of the time when we're seeing the significant impacts actually occur. There's every indication that those are going to get substantially worse in the next couple of decades and then going forward after that. And we are starting, in fact, to see more and more of a response. More than 150 heads of state came to the Paris climate negotiations in December of 2015. That's probably the single biggest gathering of heads of state in human history. Then the following year, 130-plus countries have now signed up to actually implement the Paris Climate Agreement, which is extraordinarily fast. What normally happens is you negotiate the text and adopt it, and then you have a multi-year period for hitting what are called the entry into force thresholds, how many countries need to join before it actually takes effect. And that has all proceeded much, much, much faster than would ordinarily be the case. So we're seeing a continued recognition on the parts of countries around the world, with perhaps one major exception, as to the importance of climate change.
Yes, and even China.
Absolutely. They're now the world's biggest emitter on an annual basis of greenhouse gases, the heat-trapping gases that disrupt the climate. But they've done some very interesting things in just the last few months. Last month, they canceled over 100 coal-fired power plants that were either planned or actually under construction, and that came on top of just a few months before where they had canceled 30 such plants. China's also completed, I believe it's 34 gigawatts of new solar in just the last year. So they are making very significant steps. And President Xi, when he came to when he came to Davos in January, took the opportunity to reinforce the importance of the Paris Agreement on climate, so that urging people to stay at it.
Yes, well, any of us who've visited Chinese cities and had difficulties breathing will understand the impact there. But now I come to a question which I'm a biologist myself, and one with a deep interest in evolutionary biology. And of course, what we've seen as biologists is how over the millions, billions even, of years of evolutionary history, certainly whole species have been wiped out. Whole, if I might call it this, cultures, and I mean that, of course, in a general sense, not just human culture, have essentially disappeared because we all interrelate, and there's a kind of system that has to be maintained. Do we have a future as humanity, or can we be a bit more optimistic than that? Because it's not impossible that climate change could be sufficiently great to cause great difficulties for the survival of humanity.
I think humanity is liable to survive. The question is whether our civilization will, because you get these significant consequences of more drought, more deluge, problems with food and water supplies. That leads to intensified conflict happening in multiple places around the world at the same time. If you just look at Syria, there's some indication that the drought that started a number of years ago is entirely consistent with climate change and was at least in part triggered by climate change. That then led to mass migration of farmers to cities as their agricultural systems became more and more disrupted. The cities were unable to accommodate them. Then that has led to a refugee crisis that has had major political implications throughout Europe, as you know far better than I do. So it's not just the emissions themselves of the climate disrupting gases, it's also the impacts on our food and water systems, and then the human consequences of those impacts, and they all interrelate in ways that are not terribly reassuring. There is, however, some good news.
Which is?
The good news is that we are making strides both on policy through the Paris Agreement that I already mentioned. There's also been a separate international agreement on international aviation, which is not covered by Paris, but which is a very significant emitter. It'd be in the top dozen if it were a separate country. And we also have a special agreement with respect to chemicals called hydrofluorocarbons, which are substitutes for ozone-depleting chemicals. That's now been adopted as a phase down of those chemicals over the next several years. That's likely to avoid, in and of itself, a significant chunk of global warming over the rest of this century. So we've got good progress being made on the policy front. We also have some significant progress being made on the technological front. A number of specific examples that one could give on everything from making it easier to charge electric vehicles, which is very important because they're far more inherently efficient than petrol-powered ones, that the continuing decreases in the prices of sun and wind and other renewables are very impressive, and on and on. So there's also an effort underway by governments as well as the private sector to ramp up further investment in early stage commercialization all the way through major commercialization, and indeed back to piloting of yet more and cheaper low carbon solutions, which we certainly need in the toolbox too.
So the answer is going to be to speed up those changes as much as we possibly can, and that must mean that governments have to produce the right kind of market situations to encourage all of that. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, governments have a major role to play. One of them is helping remove barriers to adoption of low-carbon solutions. Another is to deal with the fact that right now in most parts of the world, certainly in the United States, the prices are lying. We're being told throughout our market system that there is no consequence of any amount of carbon pollution being emitted. That's simply not the case. In fact, the one number we can be absolutely certain is wrong as a carbon price is 0. And that's what we have in the United States and a number of other jurisdictions.
Yes. Well, I'm sure I'm speaking for the viewers of Voices from Oxford when I say that we need people like you in the right places to ensure that all this happens. So thank you very much, Karen Florini, for talking to Voices from Oxford.
Thanks so much.